analysis to help make PAC 2030 a reality for the long-time future of the Caribbean and U.S.-Caribbean ties. Specifically, the working group will provide new ideas and recommendations to help U.S. policymakers and other stakeholders that align with Caribbean priorities to support PAC 2030's implementation. At the same time, the working group will continue to elevate Caribbean concerns and perspectives here in Washington and elsewhere, putting regional stakeholders at the forefront of U.S. policymaking. The working group builds off the relationships we've established in the region since the initiative was founded, and it's also a continuation of past work we've done on PAC 2030, including a recent report called PAC Quick Wins for a U.S.-Caribbean Partnership on Climate and Energy Resilience, which we released alongside the UN General Assembly last September. PAC 2030 has the ability to take U.S.-Caribbean relations to a new level, and importantly, ensure that the region is prepared to mitigate the consequences of the climate crisis in the long term. I'm also delighted that we'll be working closely with our Caribbean Initiative's non-resident senior fellow, Ambassador Riyad Enzanali, in this work. Now, to get us started, I'd like to turn over to Associate Director of the Caribbean Initiative, Wazim Mowla, who will moderate today's conversation. Waz, over to you.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you, Melanie, again for your vision for the Caribbean Initiative and your remarks up top. Good afternoon to everyone joining virtually, and a special welcome to our speakers. Once again, thank you for joining us today. As Jason and Melanie mentioned, today's conversation and the launch of our new PAC 2030 working group comes at a crucial moment for the Caribbean. Never before has there been such an urgent need to support Caribbean countries who are facing really the worst of the climate crisis. To shed some light on this, we have a great group of speakers today, ranging from public and private sector and the multilateral space. And our conversation will broadly cover three basic themes. First, we'll talk a little bit about the impact of climate change on Caribbean economies, talk a little bit about how to mobilize capital and financing to support the region's resilience, adaptation, and mitigation efforts, and how the United States, the Caribbean, multilateral institutions, and the private sector can all work together to address the climate crisis. And also, as Jason and Melanie have already mentioned, with CARICOM's intersessional meeting concluding earlier this month, we'll get a readout from some of our speakers on what really took place in those discussions. So before we begin, please feel free to tweet about this conversation using the hashtag #ACCaribbean and to click the link in the Zoom chat to visit our website to take a look at some of the work of the Caribbean Initiative. So as Jason and Melanie mentioned, U.S. engagement with Caribbean leaders has recently increased over the past year or so. CARICOM's intersessional took place a couple of weeks ago, and Special Envoy for Climate John Kerry, Prime Minister Trudeau from Canada, the head of the WTO, and others traveled to Bahamas for the meeting. So, Ambassador Lynch, I'd like to start with you first. Can you give us a quick overview of some of the topics that CARICOM leaders might have brought up with the U.S. and Canadian delegations that recently visited the Bahamas, and why were these visits significant for the region's own relationship with actors like the United States and Canada?
Well, first, Wazim, thank you so very much and the Atlantic Council for convening today's meeting. I also want to thank Melanie for her continued leadership in this space, continuing to put the Caribbean at the forefront of what's happening in terms of her own direction and relationship with the Caribbean. The meeting, as usual, in the Bahamas, focused on the traditional areas of development that we always focus on for the Caribbean. Clearly, the issues of health and education and infrastructure, those elements, and the economies, obviously. The more important thing, however, was the continued strengthening of the CARICOM community and the issues related to how do we really advance the single market and possibly the single economy. Those obviously dominate every gathering of this type. But this year, there were some other things that really came to the fore. One of the more important topics was the discussion focused primarily on Haiti. The situation in Haiti in that country is beyond grave at this point. 200 gangs have taken over 60% of Port-au-Prince. Urgent action is necessary to curb this crisis, because I believe that the Haitians are suffering more than we've ever seen them suffer during this period. Clearly, there was a focus on climate. The presidential envoy, President Biden's special envoy for climate, John Kerry, he was there, and he wants to expand the existing carbon credit system that there is into a global system. He also gave us very high marks and is backing the Bridgetown Initiative, which we will speak on further in this conversation. Prime Minister Trudeau, he was very keen to work with CARICOM on the climate initiatives. He also spoke a lot about the security issues that we're facing, and the issue of security, the issues of gun violence, drugs, and human trafficking, which is fueling an upsurge in crime and violence in the region, came under their scrutiny as well. None of us, as the Prime Minister Davis, who was chairing the CARICOM community, said, none of us will develop sustainably or securely if we leave our neighbors behind. And therefore, that is why the issue of Haiti again was talked about. Tackling crime and violence from a public health perspective was also put on the table. We've always looked at tackling the security issues by dealing directly with it, but we are now even more focused on looking at it through a public health lens. And in that regard, a multidisciplinary summit is to be convened in April in Trinidad and Tobago, and obviously the other areas that we want to deal with if we're going to deal with the security issues: economic growth and prosperity, legislative and political and police reforms. These form part of the holistic approach that we are bringing to seeking to move the region forward. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador Lynch, for that readout. Great points. Touching on from Haiti to climate to crime to strengthening, the economies and integration of the economies. A very important point. That's Feinstein. You were there in the Bahamas, and you would have gotten a firsthand look at some of these discussions. Can you give us what are some of the takeaways that you take from the meetings there, and then as a follow-up, how does this set the tone for future collaboration, from the U.S. side with CARICOM and its other partners?
Thanks, Wazim. And let me also extend, on behalf of the State Department, our thanks to Melanie, to Jason, to Wazim for the tremendous initiative and focus on the Caribbean and always bringing it to the fore. In terms of what was achieved coming out of the intercessional, so as you mentioned, I was privileged to be part of the delegation. It was led by Assistant Secretary Brian Nichols, the Western Hemisphere Affairs Assistant Secretary, and also included, importantly, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, also included Special Presidential Advisor Chris Dodd, and various other senior officials from the US government. I think what was important for us was the opportunity to, as Spec Harry said, to really listen, to come into these meetings eager to listen to the pain points, to listen to the challenges, and talk about what progress has been achieved, specifically under the 3 high-level action committees that were launched at the Summit of the Americas and under PAC 2030. So we were able to have a frank exchange in each of those areas, including contributions from the respective chairs from Caribbean countries of those high-level action committees, and then talk about what needs to happen going forward. We also had a good discussion on Haiti, as Ambassador Lynch mentioned, and the urgency of taking action there. We were very heartened by comments from Prime Minister Davis at the opening ceremony, specifically underscoring that there is a cost to inaction as well, to standing by while we see the situation in Haiti really intensify. So in terms of takeaways, I think we heard a lot about, obviously, the impact of climate change and Russia's war in Ukraine in terms of its devastating impact on economies in the Caribbean, on food security. We also heard about challenges related to climate finance, about some of the opportunities of pooling risk across Caribbean countries to achieve greater scale also, and make deals more attractive to the private sector. We heard about some of the challenges of attracting private sector investment in the Caribbean. Of course, the issues that Melanie mentioned with regard to the status of Caribbean countries with the multinational development banks and the real need for reform in those spaces. Spec Harry talked about how the United States will be going to the multilateral World Bank meetings, the spring meetings and fall meetings with proposals for what we can do to look at the global financial architecture and be more responsive.
Great, Barbara. That's really great to hear. You mentioned the challenges with perhaps the private sector. You mentioned the importance of some of the NDBs and Director Hunt, I'm going to go to you now. And thinking about the CARICOM meeting and the delegations that were there, where do you see the value in including institutions like the IDB to be a part of those discussions? And then Mohammed, I'll go to you to sort of bring in the sort of private sector angle.
Again, thank you. And as was previously mentioned, again, congratulations to the Atlantic Council for keeping the focus on these important issues and on the Caribbean region as a whole. At the end of the day, there is very little that you could do without money, and money is needed to help transition from a conversation to implementation. So I think having institutions, not only the IDB and other banks, development banks in the region, being part of these sessions would allow for us to hear firsthand from the leaders what exactly are their aspirations and what they would like to see happen, and how we could then play a part in making that happen with the role that we play in providing financing. In the case of the IDB, of course, the IDB is the largest development institution in the region and funding a number of the development projects. The cost of dealing with these issues is astronomical. A lot of money is required, a lot of mobilization is required. And therefore, I will think having the multilateral banks or the development banks there would allow for first-hand information to be obtained.
Thank you, Director Hunt. And Mohammed, I'll go to you now to talk a little bit about how the utility of having the private sector in some of those discussions and at the next CARICOM intersession.
Yeah, I think first of all, congratulations to the Atlantic Council and actually on the PAC 2030 as well. I think the focus on the Caribbean is something to be applauded, and that this is in fact a complex issue that requires as much inclusion and as many people coming to the table as possible. So that is in fact the angle that I would speak on. I believe that the inclusion of the private sector is something that we're seeing globally for many complex issues. We know the value of having a 360-degree perspective, but I would argue that in the case of the Caribbean, things are an additional level of complexity applies. You have the issues of scale, you have the issues of the Caribbean Sea, which separates us, also brings us together, but it separates us logistically at times. And we have, hurricanes that go through different times of the year, etc. So the private sector, I believe, has a key role to play in the sense that, we have been operating in the region. I think it's to be applauded a lot of the success that many of the private sector players have been able to have in the Caribbean, and how we can bring that success to an issue such as this one. I also believe that when you look at the private sector, and I speak also to the case of Coca-Cola, out of our office, we manage 22 countries in the Caribbean region. We already begin with a perspective that has an overall view of how do we holistically come to solution, and how do we go to the details that help us to get to those solutions in a sustainable way. Because as we've said, there is a significant amount of investment that happens that is required to go into this. And we want to make sure that we have sustainable solutions coming across the region. And then finally, I would contend that multinational companies such as ourselves can perhaps bring to bear some of the experiences that we have across the world. I do believe that there are no copy-paste solutions that we can necessarily apply to the Caribbean. It's still going to require that Caribbean genius, and this sort of forum brings that genius to the table and hopefully gets us to those solutions quicker.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you, Director Hunt. Both really unique perspectives, and I think, I like this 360 view, making it an inclusive process so everybody's at the same table looking for a very common solution. Ambassador Lynch, you talked a little bit about climate change being at the forefront of some of the conversations in the Bahamas, and I want to get from your perspective, how does climate change, how do the effects of climate change really affect the future economic trajectory of the Caribbean? And what are some of the very specific sectors that are severely impacted? And then Director Hunt, I'll go to you with the same question afterwards.
Well, I think obviously, clearly, the issues of the effects of climate change and having to react to the climate crisis has obviously made small developing island states like ours that in great measure have financed the traditional pillars of the socioeconomic development from the NDBs to now look for additional sources of financing to fund these areas. Resources that were once allocated to the traditional pillars of development, health, education, transportation, infrastructure, have now been crowded out by the fact that we've got to look for new money or other money to be able to finance the issues that climate has caused. One of the unique situations that we've been put in is that last year, or the last couple of years, we were put into a situation where we not only had to look for additional monies for climate, but for COVID as well, for the COVID crisis. And therefore, what has happened is a lot of the monies that we would have traditionally gotten from the international financial institutions has now had to be directed towards dealing with issues of crises, dealing with the climate crisis, dealing with the issues of COVID. And therefore, that is going to create a lag in terms of how we deal with other issues that are so fundamentally important to how we live and how we exist every day. And therefore, there is the one of the things that we think is really happening that is good is, for example, the IDB has recently been approved to hold the special drawing rights, the SDRs, the IMF money. And that is we think that is a positive action going forward. And also, we need really to look for new capital for IDB Invest, because one of the things that's easy to finance is you can usually finance mitigation. The private sector will put money into mitigation because that's the way in which, because there's a return on the return stream on their money. But for resilience, the state has always been looked upon to be able to get those resources. And what we're looking at now is the difficulty in funding those resources and finding those resources. And therefore, what we want to do is to see how best we can move this forward. By one, IDB Invest has allocated some new funding for mitigation. If we can increase the level of pool that we have for mitigation, then we're in good stead. And then we also need to look at how we create new instruments to be able to fund new instruments, more creative instruments, more innovative instruments to be able to fund the resilience part of what we're doing.
That's great to hear. And I love you mentioning the IDB Invest. It's a perfect segue to go to Director Hunte and get his view from his vantage point from the IDB. So please, Director.
Some of the points that Ambassador Lynch raised about the amount of funding that not only that is required, it is channeling money against other areas. So you were talking about how this will impact the development of the regions. The reality is that, climate issues, a lot of which we are talking about now, is now being brought to the fore. But the truth is, this region has been dealing with climate issues for a very long time. The statistics really shows from 1950 to now, there were almost 511 disasters that has hit the world, especially small island states. And the majority of them, over 65% of them, were actually affecting regions like the Caribbean. So we have been funneling money towards dealing with climate issues for a very long time. And therefore, that has retarded our ability to use funding that is required in education and social programs and so forth. We have heard, there's a particular prime minister, I heard a story of him speaking to the fact that, he borrowed money to take and rebuild the infrastructure and build a particular bridge, only to see it wiped out by hurricanes and only have to borrow another set of money to rebuild that particular bridge. So that has been the reality of the governments of the region. It has been that we've been dealing with this issue for a very long time, and this issue is estimated as being costing us approximately 1% of our GDP annually. As for the sectors that are going to be affected, again, it's multifaceted, it's straight across the board, because we think about climate and we think about only, the weather, the temperature and so forth. But a recent study by the ILO, for example, they estimated, not only in the Caribbean, but for the whole region, just the change in temperatures will affect the productivity issues in the region, and that will have a loss of about 2.5 million jobs within the region. And a lot of those jobs are going to be along the street vendors and a lot of that particular low-level jobs. So the impact on development of climate issues, as I said, it spreads across from tourism to agriculture to healthcare to education, because it also siphons money away that is required to help those particular areas develop. And as I said, it also has a direct impact into affecting areas like productivity together with a number of areas. There's a lot of funding that is required for both adaptive and mitigative measures, as Ambassador Lynch was speaking. And again, when money is put into those particular areas, it retards our development in other areas.
Hear from you and from Ambassador Lynch, hearing the financing needs, the amount of funding that's needed there, and that's fine. So I want to go to you and ask you a two-part question. I mean, first is, how is the U.S. government, what are some of the policies coming out of the U.S. government that are going to help sort of address climate change, and also, how do you envision the U.S. government is going to work with some of the international financial institutions to help make some of this needed financing available to Caribbean countries?
Thanks, Wazim. So a few points on that front. First and foremost, and this was a point that Spec Carey made repeatedly, in terms of our own responsibility as the United States with regard to emissions, the actual signature and enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act was one of the most significant pieces of legislation with regard to the United States doing its part to reduce emissions and fundamentally address the issue of climate change. And of course, calling on other major climate emitters through the world to own up to the issues and make their own commitments. Specifically with regard to assistance and climate financing, also wanted to reflect on the fact that one other member of our delegation, the president of the Export-Import Bank, Rita Jo Lewis, was there also to understand what the particular challenges are for finance and access to finance in the Caribbean, had a chance to meet with several of the delegations. Of course, as you know, there is already an MOU with Guyana related to increasing access to finance for small and medium-sized enterprises to engage in Guyana, and looking to see what can be done along those lines in other Caribbean countries. More broadly, with regard to engagement with the international financial institutions, there are several commitments that we've already made publicly and that we are following through on under the umbrella of PAC 2030, which includes working with the NDBs to expand the use of deferment clauses in lending, to grant temporary access for graduated countries experiencing several external shocks, temporary concessional access, I should say, improving access to concessional resources following climate-related disasters, and expanding blended financing for Caribbean nations. And of course, as Ambassador Lynch also mentioned, we are also advocating for an expansion in IDB Invest. So those are some of the things that we're working with the multilateral financial institutions. In addition, in January, USAID's Administrator Samantha Power announced a new investment to create or helps Barbados set up the new Blue-Green Investment Corporation. And when that is established, we understand it to be the first green bank in the Caribbean to finance climate change mitigation and adaptation, including resilient housing, renewable energy, green transportation, and water conservation. So this is just one of several different initiatives. I will also see if I can put in the chat through this discussion a couple of fact sheets. If not, maybe you can distribute them, that illustrate some of the very specific things we're doing under PAC 2030 and our broader U.S. Caribbean engagement. Because as Vice President Harris has told us, it's important to make commitments, but even more important than that is to follow through with actual actions. So happy to share those with you.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, As Feinstein, for your willingness to share that. Mohammed, I'm going to go to you really quickly to talk a little bit about how some of the more investment and commercial opportunities in the region are affected by the climate crisis. And then staying on this trend of talking a little bit about financing, would love to hear more from Ambassador Lynch about the Bridgetown initiative that Prime Minister Motley, who has been a champion of climate issues globally, has really been leading. But I'll start with you, Mohammed.
Yeah, sure. I think, and we spoke a bit about this a couple of minutes ago, but the impact on business coming out of climate change, it's undeniable. We've had cases in the Caribbean where, the interruption to the business is significant as a result of some of the events that we're seeing and we're witnessing in many of our countries. So we are concerned. We want to be part of the solution, but we are definitely concerned about the effects of climate change and how that risk really translates to the environment. And that goes all the way from our employees down to the customers, down to the final consumer. They're all interrupted in some way or another now with a lot of the events that we know are happening within the Caribbean. I specifically remember Honorable Prime Minister Motley mentioning about the impact of each event, call it a hurricane, for example, going up to as much as 5% of the impact on the GDP of some of our countries. That definitely has a tangible implication on business. And for us, sustainability is equal to business and business is equal to sustainability. So we are definitely concerned and focused on that. Now, on a global level, as Coca-Cola Company, we have the World Without Waste initiative, where we have committed to making 100% of our packaging recyclable, 50% of our products containing recyclable resin, and to actually collect 100% of the packaging that we put into the market, all of this by 2030. And again, as I said before, the complexities of the region require us to find well-studied solutions, sustainable solutions, in order to guarantee not only the sustainability side of things, but also the business side of things. We have been working individually and with partners across the region. We're working with the ocean cleanup in Dominican Republic and Jamaica. We have recycled resin in many of our markets. We have returnable packages as well, which we believe helps. But again, the impact on business is directly associated to how well we take on this challenge of sustainability in the region.
Yeah, thank you, Melvin. That makes the financing, climate resilient projects, mitigation, adaptation efforts that much more important. And like I mentioned earlier, the Bridgetown Initiative is being seen as a potential solution. So Ambassador Lynch would really love to get your thoughts there and talk a little bit about the Bridgetown Initiative.
Well, first of all, let me just say up front that this Bridgetown Initiative, we believe that it's a very practical initiative. It's very practical and it can work. What we need to do, though, let me preface my remarks by this, is owed to the climate crisis. And the Bridgetown Initiative fundamentally must be placed within the political frame, first and foremost. But the fact is that the Bridgetown Initiative focuses on scale. As I said previously, it's easy maybe to get money for mitigation, but for resilience purposes, that money that has traditionally come from the international financial institutions is difficult to come by. And therefore, what the Bridgetown Initiative focused on, first and foremost, is scale. Scale for funding for the climate crisis. It is estimated that developing countries need as much as $2 trillion a year in financing for climate. And the Bridgetown proposes a way to get us really close to that figure. Now, Bridgetown is fundamentally a financing system to get trillions of dollars without governments having to write a check every year. Now, no government, particularly no government that doesn't have a direct relationship or a specific relationship with small developing countries, is elected to do this. And therefore, this is new money that we're looking for. New money that is out there, the SDRs, for example, new money that's out there that we can get to deal with the issues. There's also the issues of for example, new taxation, taxing the fossil fuel companies, possibly methane producers. But we must get additional dollars if we're ever to tackle very seriously and efficiently the issues of climate change. And then the other issue about Bridgetown is building a global coalition. The world doesn't owe us anything. We're coming to that conclusion. We've come to that conclusion for a long time. But loss and damage funding is important. And therefore, what Bridgetown does is Bridgetown creates a world that is more shock absorbing, a means of better being prepared for natural disasters, natural disaster clauses in our new debt instruments. And there is for example, the IMF the rapid credit facility that needs expanding. Bridgetown assists all of the globe in converging on the issues, on the interests that are common to all of us, that are common to all states. And we've said in the past that no one is elected in the United States to look out for the issues that Barbados is facing or any small developing country is facing. But the Bridgetown Initiative focuses on converging on the issues that are going to affect all of us. This is a multidimensional crisis. For example, climate is spoken about only maybe in terms of hurricanes or increased weather systems, but there are migration issues that come out of climate. And therefore, climate must be seen as multidimensional, and the focus must be on a multidimensional solution to deal with some of the issues within climate. And we believe that Bridgetown is one of those tools that can assist us in getting there.
Thank you, Ambassador. Really important initiative and definitely multidimensional crisis with hopefully a multidimensional solution as well. I'd like to, we talked a lot about financing. We talked a lot about the effects of climate change, but what about the capacity of countries to be able to absorb some of this financing, and as well as the tools and technologies that are going to be needed over the next 5, 10, 15 years? So that's Feinstein. I'll start with you. And some of those tools and technologies, right? What are some of them that the U.S. is able to help provide to the Caribbean to enhance local capacity, knowing that enhancing local capacity is actually one of the key pillars of PAC 2030? And then Director Hunt, going to you afterwards to talk about what is the role of the IDB there to help with capacity as well. So that's Feinstein. I'll start with you.
Thanks, Wazim. So I think from our perspective, it's critically important to support those institutions within the Caribbean who are charged with doing this work, so that they have the capacity to take it forward and so that our investments are sustainable. To that end, the US government has made very significant investments over time in the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, CIMH, in CDEMA, the Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Agency. We're also looking at other institutions within the Caribbean and what we can do to expand their capacity to provide the kind of tools that is necessary for example, expanded weather forecasting, improving maps and data, GIS, early warning systems. That's the kind of expertise that we are currently providing in terms of training and technical assistance. We also have partnerships, for example, with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, here in the United States, and in that specific instance with Antigua and Barbuda. So we feel that providing some of those kinds of tools, countries will be in a better position to expand their resilience and not just immediate response to climate change.
Thanks, Das Feinstein. And since we're coming up on time, I'll go quickly to you, Director LaHunt, and then we'll do a quick sort of 30 seconds for each of you to just sort of drive home the message that you think is definitely crucial for this moment.
The reality is that the IDB is more than just a bank. We are already engaged with our member countries to build capacity in their respective institutions. We can talk about absorptive capacity. This has indeed been an issue in the Caribbean, but the bank is clearly focused on addressing this absorptive capacity in the region. Building the necessary institutions requires grant funding and the key understanding how we can bring this assistance more rapidly. The IDB is continually developing knowledge products that can bring innovation and data to the region, which can transform how the capacity is developed and retained. These efforts form part of the strategies to ensure that we are bringing solutions to the bottlenecks that can be obstacles to development. So we understand the issue associated with absorption capacity. We understand that the regions, even if they get all the money, the ability to spend that money will not be 100% viable. And therefore, we have been working in that space, and we continue to work in that space to build the absorption capacity of the region to be able to spend the money when they get them in an effective manner.
Thank you, Director LaHunt. And I'll turn to Mohammed to give us just quick, 15, 20 seconds of the final thoughts, and then give you the last word, Ambassador Lynch.
No, I would say my final thought would pretty much be that, we've seen it in the business side of things. When we approach things, as we call it, as one Caribbean, we are exponentially more successful. And so we're very encouraged by what's happening today and what will continue to happen. And I believe that you can also count on our support on expertise and other areas as we push forward.
Thank you. And Ambassador Lynch.
Finally, Wazim, I'd say this, I'll repeat, we're all in this together. The issues are that climate change doesn't affect any one particular state. And I really value the partnership of the international financial institutions, of countries like the United States and Canada, obviously. And then obviously we need private sector expertise. The private sector's got a scorecard of doing excellent work. They need now to bring that excellent scorecard and that experience to assisting us in helping through the climate crisis.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Lynch. And once again, I want to thank all of our speakers for taking the time to discuss such an important topic. Once again, thank you to Melanie Trần, the founder of the Caribbean Initiative, Jason Marzak, Senior Director of the Adrian Arce Latin America Center, and of course, my colleague, Felipe Felix Mendez, who helped coordinate this event. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.